talking to Tom Mann, the Administrator of the Veteran Services Division for the Oregon Department of Veterans Affairs. Tom, glad to have you on the phone with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much.
One of the concerns we have returning servicemen and women to some extent from Iraq and Afghanistan is the issue of PTSD. And it can put some law enforcement in jeopardy. For example, a case that recently happened in Georgia where a National Guardsman was drunk and was firing an M4 at passing vehicles and then shot and killed a sheriff's deputy. Kind of problematic for law enforcement if they're responding to a call involving a PTSD serviceman and they're not aware of it, isn't it?
Oh, it can be, depending on the circumstances.
So what's law enforcement to do? How do they handle these situations?
Well, the first thing that we've done is the Oregon Department of Veterans Affairs has spent some time along with our partners within the reintegration team meeting with law enforcement and training them on what post-traumatic stress is, what the symptomology is, and when they are dealing with veterans, a good way to go about that. One of the things that we've told law enforcement is first try to identify if the person involved is a veteran, and then second, veteran-to-veteran contact is very important, and so we've been trying to implement programs where if you have veterans on your staff with law enforcement, that they're called in, or there are veteran volunteers that work with law enforcement, can engage those situations so veterans could talk to veterans, because you'll find sometimes that relationship and that connection that the veteran who's having the law enforcement issue can de-escalate that situation with another veteran.
What about law enforcement, though, that may be just responding to a call of shots fired and they don't really know they're going to a PTSD situation? That's a real danger zone, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the most difficult. One of the things that we try to do is also train the 911 employees to, when they have somebody on the phone for a shots fired. We've had issues, for example, in Gresham, where the family members called and were able to tell the 911 operator that, yes, it is a veteran, yes, this person is being treated by the VA for post-traumatic stress. And so when the law enforcement arrived, they had a much better idea. So for law enforcement, as you can imagine, the more information they have, the better for them to handle the situation and do the things that they need to do. Unfortunately, sometimes these things escalate to the point where the law enforcement folks have to protect themselves and others. We also try to educate the veterans what law enforcement is looking for. I'll give you a great example of some of the conflict, however. When you're in Iraq and you're doing your job there as a soldier, one of the first things you want to do when you're doing your work is you want to see the hands of the person who's coming at you or the person you're working with. Well, for law enforcement, the first thing you want to see is your hands if you're someone that they're going to be dealing with. So you have this kind of standoff where everyone wants to see each other's hands to make sure everyone's safe. Well, you can imagine how that plays itself out. So we try to train everybody that when you come back here to the States after your deployment, these are some of the things you need to be aware of, and they're simple things. Some of our veterans are having problems where they think they see an IED on the side of the road and they speed through an area and they get pulled over by the police for speeding. Two more complicated things, with a veteran who has post-traumatic stress who may be having some kind of flashback or delusion of some sort, or is suicidal, or whatever the case might be. For the police end of things, the more training, the better for us in terms of explaining what it is they're dealing with so they can help identify that through the symptomology, getting other veterans involved, but also the work we do with veterans to make sure that if they are at risk or having issues, that they're getting the treatment they need, that making sure they're seeing their counselor, making sure they're getting their medication and taking their medication, and making sure that they have the support systems in place when things aren't going well for them.
One of the things that's very dangerous for law enforcement is that these servicemen are very trained in how to use weapons and how to kill people. So that puts law enforcement at risk, doesn't it?
Well, I think that law enforcement's at risk in lots of situations. With service members or veterans, yeah, they've been trained how to use weapons. They know how to do that, so they have to take extra precautions, certainly.
PTSD, I guess a lot of people in the public are wondering just how many cases of PTSD there are. How do we quantify that? Any way?
Sure. I think you have to understand with post-traumatic stress disorder that there's mild versions of it, there's moderate versions of it, there's severe versions, and not every veteran who has post-traumatic stress has an issue with violence or any of these kind of things. The literature out there says about 20% of our returning soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are going to be affected with some level of post-traumatic stress. And so here in Oregon, we've had about 7,000 soldiers and airmen deploy through the National Guard that are back in Oregon. Plus, we get about 200 of the active duty folks that come back a month. So we all in all, maybe say 10,000 folks that have deployed. My understanding from the recent numbers is all Oregonians. That doesn't mean they're in Oregon, but all Oregonians who have deployed to the Afghan or Iraq theaters is about 30,000. And so you take 20% of that, you figure about 20% are struggling with some level of post-traumatic stress. The severe cases, however, are the folks that are having suicidal or homicidal ideation, meaning they're thinking of harming themselves or other. They are having frequent flashbacks. They're having disturbances when they sleep, and that they're having those kind of bad dreams of what combat was like. They may be delusional and have a disassociative situation where they think that they're back in that combat zone because something triggers them. That's not the majority of folks that have post-traumatic stress. The majority have it at a mild or moderate state where they have some irritation issues and they have some issues of being around large crowds and those type of things. So what's hard to quantify is if a policeman gets a call to go to a veteran's home who has post-traumatic stress, the next question you need to ask is at what level are they suffering at a minimum mild kind of state? Are they moderate or are they severe? Because it will affect how you respond to that very differently.
What about the stressors that they're facing with as they're returning home? The economy, no jobs, maybe they've just gotten a foreclosure notice in their home. Can those be a trigger point to escalate maybe some symptoms of post-traumatic stress?
Well, post-traumatic stress, one of the symptoms can be anxiety and or depression, and so you can exasperate those pieces of post-traumatic stress with a sense of hopelessness if they don't feel they can keep their home or meet their responsibilities financially, if they've lost their job because they've had issues with anger on the job. So certainly those are mounting pressures on somebody with post-traumatic stress, feeling as if they're failing their family. Those type of things can certainly, I wouldn't call it a trigger because it's not triggering an episode of post-traumatic stress, but it certainly is adding to the stress of one of the conditions of depression or anxiety.
What can family members do to help? And then what is the problem with, is there a tendency for servicemen to try to deal with it, try to man up and say, suck it up, you can walk it off kind of thing?
Let me deal with the last question first. Military culture, as you know, is to suck it up and drive on. You're problem solvers. You're supposed to be able to rub some dirt on that wound and keep going. And so admitting that you have a problem, admitting that you are broken, admitting that you're defective is the antithesis of the mission, it's the antithesis of the motto. It's not what you do as a military person. And so that's part of it is when we see veterans who have these symptomologies and we get them into their counseling, first we have to explain to them that it's not a weakness to have a combat injury. This is something that happened to you while you were in combat, and we're going to work through it. The part about the family is important because it's always the family that sees this stuff firsthand. And the hard part is the veteran will not want the family to tell anybody they're struggling, but that's a catch-22 because the struggle will then get worse if nobody knows about it and they don't get help. So we always talk to the families about getting a hold of their local county veteran service officer or getting a hold of the Oregon Department of Veterans Affairs or even the military department and saying, hey, I think I've got an issue here. Would you guys help us out? There's plenty of us that have the resources and actually interest and time, and this is what we do to help those folks. We want to intervene. We want to walk them through the process. We want to get them the counseling they need. If they're at a more severe level, get them the medication they need to do the things that they need to do so they can get back on track. Because post-traumatic stress is something that can be worked with. You can have even severe cases that get better through counseling and time. And so it's not like a death sentence when you get this thing. We all can work together to make this a better situation. But it's hard for a veteran, especially new combat veterans who come home. That's just not our ethic in the military to say that you've got a problem and you can't handle it. So part of it's that military culture kind of getting through that.
What would you say to family members who may be afraid to tell on their, family person, maybe their spouse? I went to your commanding officer and said, we've got a problem here, and they're afraid that could escalate the situation in itself.
It could, because one of the things that our National Guard members are concerned about is if anybody knows this, I'm going to lose my job. And there's some reality to that. If you have post-traumatic stress at a level that makes you unfit for duty, yeah, you definitely could lose your job. And so that is really a difficult one. And we don't want family members to put themselves at risk, but we also understand that a veteran who's not being treated is eventually going to be at risk anyway. And so a family member has to make that decision at what point is proper. Now, understand, with post-traumatic stress, you're just not a raging lunatic all the time. There are times when you're with your family and things are just fine. There are times when you're triggered and you have your responses. So my advice to family members is during that time when things are calm and they're not triggered and things are okay, that's when you talk to them. You don't try to talk to a male or female veteran, because both males and females have post-traumatic stress. Don't try to get into the argument with them once they're triggered, because that's just not going to be productive. But during those times when the veteran is calm and is in a good frame of mind, talk to them and say, this is just not the way we can live. We need to move forward and do something different.
What are the typical trigger points?
Oh, there can be lots of trigger points. You can have look at the five senses, for example. There can be a smell that reminds you of a smell back in Iraq. You can see a bag of McDonald's on the side of the road, and that will remind you of an IED. One of the things that's kind of triggering veterans of IEDs are roadkill, if you can believe that, because the insurgents were putting explosives in roadkill and then setting them off as the vehicles would go by. So that's a piece. You may see something that looks like something that you recognize. You may hear a sound that reminds you of a sound of something else. It's a lot of sensual kind of input that then triggers the mind back to the memory of what you have experienced, that then triggers you. Another trigger can be crowds. If you're a veteran who has the symptomology of hypervigilance, meaning you don't really feel comfortable and safe, and you're always kind of watching your perimeter and making sure you're safe. If you get into large crowds where you don't feel comfortable about your safety, that can trigger an episode of needing to escape. There's some claustrophobia things. If you get in a room where, if you were to come to my office, for example, and sit down at my desk and I close the door on you, that might kind of freak you out because there's no exit, there's no way out. So there's a lot of different things that can trigger you, probably as many things as you experienced in your combat tour can trigger you if it's a memory.
What can people do to help? I'm sure everyone would like to do something to make the ease back into civilian life as easy as possible.
What I tell folks is this. For years we've been saying, well, thank you for your service, welcome home, thank you for your service. The next thing that we say is, how are you doing? We don't ask that, and if you were to ask that, especially veterans listening to your show, we have a responsibility to take care of our brothers and sisters. And so not just thank you for what for your service and what you did, but how are you doing? And ask that sincerely. How's your marriage? How's your job? How are your relationships? Is there anything that I can help you with? Because we need to be reaching out to each other and recognizing the fact that things are pretty hard right now. The economy's bad. Marriages of those who have been deployed are at risk. I've heard large numbers of divorces within the deployed population. We know that the post-traumatic stress is an issue. We know traumatic brain injury is an issue. Something that's never talked about are just all the orthopedic issues that happen. Everything from ankle and knee issues to a lot of back and neck issues. So there's a lot of struggle out there, and veterans trying to go back to school on the new GI Bill, but are struggling in school. People trying to go back to work, but are struggling in their jobs. If you don't ask them, how are you doing, there's nothing then we can do when they tell us. And so I just encourage folks, especially veterans, reach out to your brother and sisters in our veteran community and say, thanks for your service, how you doing? Can I help you in any way?
TBI seems to be very prevalent. I talked to many returning servicemen, and they always mentioned TBI. We didn't know what TBI was before. It's traumatic brain injury. But how many, percentage-wise, and I know this guess, I know it varies, how many returning servicemen have some kind of issue with traumatic brain injury?
That number's a big issue, and I've seen numbers as high as 40%. And what it is in especially the Iraq theater, more so now in Afghanistan than before, the multiple exposure to concussive explosions, whether it be an IED, that improvised explosive device, or a rocket-propelled grenade or a mortar, you don't have to be in the kill zone in order to have the concussiveness happen from those events. The concussive blast of an IED can be hundreds of meters. So you could be completely safe in your vehicle from the actual blast exposure, but the concussion of the blast is going to rock you a little bit. And so all these little mild head injuries add up. So you may think, I've never had a problem where I got really rocked by any of the explosions, but you may have been a part of about 15 or 20 of them during your tour, and all those little ones add up. And you may find when you get home you're not able to concentrate as much, or you get those headaches, or your vision's going, or you're having some cognitive issues. And so, again, like post-traumatic stress, there's mild, there's moderate, and there's severe traumatic brain injury. And we have a lot of mild to moderate traumatic brain injury out there. And that'll affect you in your work. It'll affect you in the school, in your schoolwork, because you can't concentrate. It's hard to focus. You do get those headaches. You don't feel well. You don't sleep well. You can have some irritation issues. Some of the symptoms look a little like post-traumatic stress, so you have to be very careful when you're doing the assessment on folks to find out what is what, especially if they have both. And so, yeah, that's just another issue we have to deal with. But like post-traumatic stress, with the right treatment and working through cognitive issues and making sure that you identify it early enough, there are ways to help veterans either manage that disability and get around whatever limitations there are, or even get better.
Now, do we have a perfect storm emerging? We have President Obama says that all of the troops will come home from Iraq by the end of the year, so they'll be home by Christmas. So on one hand, that's great news to have them home, but we're going to have a lot of returning servicemen come in all at once. Do we have the resources to do it? And it's when I say perfect storm, because the economy, the tax revenue isn't as strong as it was, so we probably don't have as much money to get as many or pay for as many services as we really need.
Right. What's going to be interesting about that for Oregon is this. When the 41st Brigade came home about a year ago, they had about 50% of the 2,300 soldiers were unemployed. So when we have large contingents come home, there are reintegration issues that we have to be prepared for, not just employment, education, disability benefits, the whole gambit. With the 30 to 40,000 that are in Iraq right now, most of those troops are active duty. We don't have a lot of Oregon Guardsmen there. If you're active duty, what's going to happen is you're going to go back to your military base, whether that's in Germany or in the United States, wherever that might be, and you're going to be in garrison. And so who's going to be providing those services is the military instead of the community. And so it'll be a little bit different. It all depends on whether they're coming home to the state as a National Guard or Reserve member, or they're coming back to a military base as a garrison soldier. And so what I need to find out from the demobilization perspective, when they're going to come back from their mobilizations, how many are coming back to Oregon. I think we have a couple hundred out right now, because we just got a big contingent back, about 1,100 from a unit from Idaho. And so I don't think we have a whole bunch of people downrange. The question is going to be, when they get home, are they going to go turn around and go right back to Afghanistan? And so I don't see this being a short-term problem. And as we know with the Vietnam generation, it's taken the Vietnam generation 30 to 40 years to come get their benefits. We're hoping that the Iraq and Afghanistan generation doesn't take that long. But for some, it's going to be a 10-year process for them to get to a point where they're willing to seek the help that they need. And we just know that. And so the consequences and the costs of war don't end just when the war does.